Thank you very much, Patricia. It has indeed been a dream for about 25 years to come to Ljubljana. I'm very happy also to be in this museum and to learn a great deal in the last hour about 19th century Slovenian architecture, about which I knew absolutely nothing. So this lecture is really not intended in any way to illuminate the exhibition per se, but I guess just as a bit of a prelude, it's interesting for me to come back to the 19th century, about where I originally trained and where originally all my research was. I haven't worked on 19th century topics for many years, and indeed, I think in the intervening time, the fascination with 19th century has really waned. When I was a student in the 1970s, was a great period of questioning modernism, and it seemed that to study the 19th century was really a very, very interesting, almost radical thing to do. And I think in the many years since that time, there's been a great loss of interest in the 19th century, as well as I think a recasting of the 19th century as a century of enormous conservatism. And so I hope a little bit to challenge that point of view as I go back. I first started to think about this again earlier this year, and hence the title of this PowerPoint, in conjunction with an exhibition at the Deutsches Architekturmuseum on German and French architectural interchanges, which in itself was rather fascinating, because one of the great problems in thinking about 19th century architecture is that it is almost always thought through the idea of the nation state. Obviously, one of the great ideologies of the 19th century is the nation state. So the idea that there might be actually some common theoretic ground in 19th century architectural practices that might be discerned outside of national borders has always fascinated me. So this particular presentation goes back and forth across the Rhine, and it looks at a number of key figures in French and German architecture in the middle decades of the 19th century. And it asks, I guess, the question, as incredibly diverse and different as the appearance of their architecture might be, what do these practices have in common, and why might we be interested in them 150 years later? So let me start with where you don't expect to start, which was with these two images. And I want to read you a quote, which is the following, and I'm not going to identify it. Architects who construct monuments should consider themselves as writers of future history. They should indicate in their works the characteristic of the time in which they were built, and they should finally, by duty and by love of truth, inscribe in their buildings indisputable signs of the period of construction. Now, what fascinates me about this quote is that if you read it very, very quickly, it sounds like it might be pronounced by either of the two people on the screen, that architecture should look like its moment in time. And we might start looking immediately through modernist manifestos of the 1920s in order to find the source of this quote that I've detached from its context. Certainly, its author has to be an architect who is an advocate of an architecture freed from the baggage of the past, someone who is firmly convinced that an architect's call is to be the self-conscious interpreter or medium of the zeitgeist, of the spirit of the age. No doubt a Le Corbusier or a Mies van der Rohe would have been shocked to discover what I'm about to tell you, that the voice you are listening to is none other than that of Charles Garnier, writing in 1871. So this is a quote from the author of the Paris Opera, this building that, of course, Le Corbusier loved to hate. He depicts it, ironically enough, I suppose, as a building of its time, here on the far right in this famous illustration from Vers une Architecture, where, of course, the monument of the 20th century is a steamship. So, in a certain way, ambiguously, Garnier is an epic representative of his time, but for Corbusier, a representative of a time that was burdened with history. The Paris Opera is not an example of the 19th century, but rather a kind of misguided neo-Baroque. Garnier himself, therefore, the kind of ultimate example of the architect who is a victim of the burden of of history in the 19th century at the expense of a sense of the contemporary. And indeed, it seems to me in a whole variety of ways, this quote and the possibility to paraphrase it on both sides of the debates of the early 20th century takes us right to the heart of what really interests me, some of the central paradoxes that accompanied the rise of historicist architecture, and particularly in France and Germany, which I think are the leading places where practice is theorized in those decades, in England to a certain extent, France and Germany in the 1820s and the 1830s. So that a quote can work on either side of what is thought to be an absolutely seminal break in the history of architecture and the history of thought is fascinating enough. And it takes us back to what I really want to look at with you tonight, which is a period when the very profession of architecture, we might say, was put under the banner of the necessity of the architect not only to understand the historical past, buildings as sources of imagery or forms, but to understand history itself as a process. And it was really also right at that point, and this is going to be a key point for the next few minutes as I set this talk up, that for the first time we have theories about the necessity to be of one's time. The Saint-Simonian doctrine that's absolutely key to almost all the architects I want to show you, which with its mantra over and over again, il faut être de son temps. You must be of your own period, you need to be of your own time. As we will also see, it's a fact that I think is too infrequently pointed out, the term avant-garde that we so associate with artists and architects of the 19-teens and 1920s was actually first coined in 1828 as an expression for a new artistic demeanor. So I think it really, so I guess the one thing I wanted to bring to you to talk about an exhibition, very irresponsible to accept an invitation to talk about an exhibition you haven't yet seen, but the one thing I thought as a kind of missionary for the 19th century is that I would bring to you the disturbing piece of information that the avant-garde is a 19th century invention. And I think once you think about the notion of the avant-garde as a 19th century invention, it invites a rethinking of 19th century architectural practice and thinking. Key is, as we've already heard in the quote that I started with, the architects who construct building monuments should consider themselves as writers of future history. So this elision, this confusion or deliberate blurring between writing and making architecture is one that invites us to consider historicist architecture itself as a text, and a text that shares both the strategies and paradoxes of historical writing in the wake of what I'd like to call the Romantic Revolution. So I think you're going to notice that another key point that I want to stress this evening, and one that I've, in all of my writings on the 19th century, including the textbook I wrote a number of years ago, I have refused to use the words revivalism, neo, all of these things that really, I think, render a very, very simplistic notion of what intellectually and artistically was at stake in much 19th century practice. The Romantic Revolution in architecture, much less well known than perhaps its equivalents in literature, painting, sculpture, or even music, and not coincidentally, I illustrate this with paintings by architects, and very, very well-known ones. On the upper left, Leo van Klens's painting of his own building, the Valhalla, in the valley of the Danube, near Regensburg, and in the bottom right, I'm sorry, a little bit blurry, one of many scores of imaginary Gothic cathedrals projected by Karl Friedrich Schinkel in the years on either side of the battles between the Prussians and the Napoleonic invasions. So they can stand in for a moment for this Romantic Revolution. And as much as it looked to the historical past, it also was immediately inspired by what was thought of as cutting-edge thought, and that was new theories of the very nature of history, its underlying laws, and the nature of change, and the idea that historical study could lead one to understand the very nature of change. It was not simply then a matter of stylistic pluralism, Greek versus Gothic, challenging the earlier hegemony of late 18th century neoclassicism, but Romanticism's quest in a more fundamental way to redefine the very nature and the calling of the discipline of architecture, to put architecture in liaison, or at least in parallel, with the most incisive and probing systems of thought, then offering mastery of both the geographical and the temporal diversity of the world, namely history, linguistics, and the natural sciences. A number of years ago, I tried to write a book about Karl Friedrich Schinkel, for instance, that tried to demonstrate the way in which his looking for a theory of architecture was directly related to his interaction with new theories of history, new theories of the structure of language, but also new theories of the scientific world. And that's a kind of unrealized project of mine, is to write a history of 19th century architecture from the point of view of the revolution of natural science and natural history. Something I think would be very, very timely to do, because I teach a lot of architecture students who very much talk to me about the parametric revolution and how for the first time architecture is going to be related to underlying laws of biology and underlying systems, etc. And I think this is absolutely a kind of neo-19th century idea. I can cite all sorts of inspirations for that. So I would like ultimately to write a long history of the both poetic and productive interactions between ideas of natural history and biology in particular, and architecture. But I'm not going to do that tonight. Rather, tonight I want to look at one other intellectual horizon that underscores all 19th century architectural production, both that with theoretic pretensions, and that, like much of it upstairs, which is actually following in the wake of models that have been put forth by theorizing architects. And that is the relationship between the science of history, as it's defined in the 1820s and 1830s in architectural practice. So architects trained around the turn of the century, around 1800, to understand the highest calling of their art to be the continued effort to approach more fully an ideal, both in terms of the aesthetic definitions and individual designs, began to face in the years after 1830 new challenges. Now, the standard scenario portrayed by most old-fashioned art histories, and the ones that I grew up on, which are themselves born out of notions of that art progresses through a series of revolutionary paradigm shifts, presents a series of classically romantic rejections around 1825 to 1830 of an intractably conservative establishment in favor of something fresh, new, and of the moment. And this is true to a certain extent, but like most myths of the avant-garde, it actually pays very little attention to what carries on. So the standard scenario for Germany would be a universal neoclassicism of the type represented by Langhans's Brandenburg Gate, ironically enough, of 1789. And then Schinkel's supposed stylistic eclecticism, the fact that Schinkel could simultaneously proposed the same project in Gothic and in Classic. Actually extremely interesting, because in both of them he tries to work out a structural system that could be conjugated in these two different languages. Or, for that matter, in France, what is often seen as the rejection of the Napoleonic synthesis of the Neo-Roman, embodied here in the bombastically large Church of the Madeleine, begun or pushed into that form under Napoleon, and the kind of reaction and rejection of the universal adaptation of a perfect temple form for all architecture, be it ecclesiastical or public in France, Chamber of Deputies facing it on the right, in favor of a radically different architecture that does not immediately suggest its historical sources. For instance, here, a building that has preoccupied me for many years, and then in a recent exhibition, Henri Labrouste's great reading room of the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris of 1838 to 1850, to which we'll return. But what I want to do is place these practices, whether it be Schinkel reacting in the 1820s to the neoclassical synthesis of turn-of-the-century Prussia, or Labrouste and his friends who called themselves Romantics, their reaction to new theories of the philosophy of history. And particularly key for this in France is the translation into French simultaneously, widely read by architects and all intellectuals, of two of the great 18th century texts on the philosophy of history, Edgar Quinet's translation of Herder and Jules Michelet's translation of Vico. These were very, very widely discussed, and they were thought almost to be, I suppose they were in a way, the Foucault and Lacan of 1830. Anyone who was a kind of thinking intellectual was to engage with the excitement generated by the making available of the notion of a philosophy of history. Now, likewise, the artists in the various German states engaging with the philosophy of history professed by Hegel and his pupils, as well as the symbolic forms, the history of symbolic forms in the popular writings of theoreticians of the symbol, such as Friedrich Kreutzer. Now, it's amazing, these are all incredibly everyday names in the 19th century, largely forgotten today. And I underscore them not to make you write down a reading list that you must go and follow up on, but in order to underscore what I really want to show you is not only an artistic project, but is great intellectual project of the years after 1830. For, as I said at the beginning, we should not forget that it was between 1828 and 1830 that the term avant-garde made its great move from military strategy, just at the moment when new ballistics means that the military technique of the avant-garde is completely useless. At that point, it is readopted metaphorically as a call to a new vision of an artistic demeanor, the idea of the artist as the vanguard or the leader, the artist who is somebody who is doing this future writing, this history that is already a history with the sense of the immediate future. As the Romantic critic, theorist, and promoter, and we're going to see him a lot this evening, Hippolyte Fortoul, another forgotten name, but incredibly important to this intellectual nexus, wrote, art and literature, like history, have been in our times entirely re-envisioned in the relationship with the destiny of human society. So to this notion of a kind of self-consciousness about human destiny, I think marks a tremendous intellectual break with the received knowledge of the 18th century. Now, one thing that will begin as well to change is the exclusive hold of the classical landscapes of Italy as the only destination for artistic travel. So if the 18th century very famously is the period of the culture of the Grand Tour, the kind of desire to know the Italian and ultimately the Greek landscape, the Grand Tour would begin to lose some of its prestige in the 19th century. Increasingly, it was rivaled by a culture of tours of observation among the industrialized countries of Europe north of the Alps. And the intense quest for national identities in the post-Napoleonic world would also lead to an increased interest in the destiny of nations and their abilities to play one off another. So, for instance, let's see what this is going to take us to. Excuse me for just one sec. I think I'm going to skip over a little bit these are generally seen as the kind of models of neoclassicism, particularly Quatremaire de Quincy and his idea of the ideal, against which we're going to be looking at generations who are responding to these key saint-Simonionist doctrines. This is one of the texts that first begins to talk about the artist as visionary, two artists, the past and the future of Beaux-Arts, of the fine arts, by Barrault, who's the definer of the avant-garde. There is his tomb in Paris, along with the enormous prestige of natural science, and in particularly the work of people like Alexander von Humboldt, who has a tremendous appeal to artists because he popularizes the idea that all of the diversity of nature can be understood in relationship to underlying systems of order that lie below the visual. So this becomes extremely important for taxonomic attempts to understand the concept of style in architecture and how it should play out in the search for the new. So this standing in for the Grand Tour, this is Leo von Klenze, designing and drawing the great giants at Agrigento, in place of the emergence, not that people stopped going to Italy, but equally begins to emerge in the 19th century, the Grand Tour of modernity. And so I'm extremely interested in the expansion of artistic travel, not only nostalgia for the lost past, but the idea to go particularly to cities that are rapidly changing and observe their change as a kind of tourism of modernity. And this is particularly going to lead architects from Germany and from Central Europe towards Paris and London as destinations of travel. So here, the German architect Friedrich Gilli studying what is brand new architecture, the first arcaded street in Paris on a trip of 1797, or for that matter, Karl Friedrich Schinkel being sent, the second or third in a long line of what could be written, the industrial espionage of German architects, going to Paris and London in order to look at the latest building technology. So these are the types of buildings that Schinkel would study when he went to Paris, the great iron roof structures of the wheat market on the top, or the invisible but very innovative truss system, iron truss system of the Brongniar's stock exchange. Now, although historians have insisted, particularly German historians, over and over again on the impact of British factory architecture on Schinkel's work of the late 1820s and 1830s, this too is a very interesting phenomenon because, of course, Schinkel was looking at factories, but he was not actually copying them, being inspired by them in projects such as this, the unrealized bazaar for Unter den Linden in Berlin of the early 1830s, or one of the first purpose-built schools of architecture ever conceived. What would a building for architecture look like? The Bau Academy on the banks of the Spree of the mid-1830s, now the subject of a huge controversy in Berlin whether or not it should be rebuilt. I've lost a lot of friends by being against that reconstruction, but that's another story. But I think it's interesting, and I think that, in fact, this notion of Schinkel as a proto-modern, because he was able to copy factories, is very much a myth. Interesting to dip into Schinkel's letters, and in particular, a letter in which he draws a comparison between France and England. Now, according to this modernist scenario, he should absolutely adore England, the land of factories, and find France the somewhat backward in the race of the Industrial Revolution. But writing of English factories, Schinkel notes, and here he's writing actually to Pierre Fontaine, the great architect associated with Napoleon, of Percier and Fontaine, and he writes to him in French. I think Schinkel had much greater access to things in France because he spoke French and did not speak English. But he writes in French to him, but I'll try to give you a rough translation. Among all the great productions that I have seen here in the British Isles, I have seen very, very few which have the character of a monument. In other words, have artistic character. Most of them present the most rudimentary utilitarianness, arranged not by artists, but by simple workers. So in fact, Schinkel was extremely critical of the fact that the British were unable to translate utilitarian need into artistic expression in a certain sense, as we'll see as we go forward, unable to respond to the intellectual challenges of both history and natural history in the search for the form of modernity, a keen sense that there must be a form of modernity, but also a keen longing of how to find it. And one of the real giveaways is this recently rediscovered Christmas card. He used to draw Christmas cards for his friends. And this is a Christmas card that he sent to Peter Beuth, who was the Prussian Minister of Commerce, chief commercial and industrial spy on these trips to England. And it represents an allegory of Peter Beuth riding Pegasus over the being polluted English landscape of Birmingham or Manchester, with a kind of view towards the dreamland of Slovenia and Italy in the distance. So here is where, that's this sort of whole setup of the problematic from the you must be of your time, the invention of the avant-garde, and then the notion that even the modern must be tamed by learning the laws of some kind of system that could explain the diversity of form, whether it be natural history or what I want to emphasize tonight, history. So for me, 1828 is the key date. Might be said to mark the birth of Romantic architecture in Western Europe, or at least in France and in the German-speaking states. For in that year, two great controversies took place, two great manifestos in a certain way were written, and we tend to think of the manifesto too as a 20th century form, but I'm arguing here that 1828 sees a kind of birth of the Architectural Manifesto, in the sense that both of these acts that I want to show you were meant to shock. They were meant to create controversy, they were meant to create discussion, and they were meant to create a sense of a rupture from the past. Interestingly enough, this rupture from the past would take the form of a historical demonstration. So what I'm also arguing for is that history in the 19th century is a form of radical thought. So in that year, in 1828, the French Academy was rocked by the young architect Henri Labrouste's challenging restoration study of the temples of Paestum in Greek Sicily, along with it a provocative written memorandum in which he questioned the notion of any universal ideal in architecture in favor of a narrative of the emergence of relative and local architectures adapted always to time and place through the progressive transformations and adaptations of received models. That, the other we'll see in a moment, is accompanied around the other figure here, Heinrich Hoopes, a lesser known German today, but extremely important at the time. Here are one of the spectacular large-scale drawings, big folio sheets like this. We recently were able to exhibit them again in New York, but when they were exhibited at the World's Fair of 1878, so exactly 50 years after they were made, they were so famous that they led the great theoretician and Gothic revivalist Viollet-le-Duc to recall in an article that year about Labrouste now dead, that Labrouste's drawings of Paestum were quite simply a revolution on a couple of sheets of double folio paper. Of course, you can imagine that when I put these about a year ago in the Museum of Modern Art, I thought, how are people ever going to understand that watercolor drawings from the 19th century of Greek temples could be a revolutionary act? That these are avant-garde works of art in the same place as Picasso and Braque, etc. It was a real design challenge. That's what architecture museums always have to do, is how to create the atmosphere in which architectural material, very dry and not immediately apparent to the general public, can come to life. So that would perhaps be another talk, how to design an exhibition about Labrouste so that one could see immediately what Viollet-le-Duc was talking about when he said that these were quite simply a revolution on a couple of sheets of elephant paper. This incident now, in the wake of interpretations of the 1970s that revived an appreciation of the radicality of Labrouste, is fairly well known, so I'll just give it in perhaps its most overall form. But the most important thing here was twofold. One, and this I think is actually very interesting to see in the city of Pleshnik, because Pleshnik's architecture to me is all about these extraordinary traces on the surface and the sense that there's something that you're supposed to be reading in the architecture. Labrouste upset the academicians for a number of reasons. One, he took the three temples at Paestum and said that they actually dated in a particular sequence, and that they did not represent a move towards the finding of the ideal, but rather they moved towards the finding of an expression that was local. Secondly, he restored all of the buildings, including graffiti. This too I think is very interesting for Pleshnik. These shields that are hung up, because he's interested in how social and civic acts give rise to the vocabulary of architecture, so that the vocabulary of architecture itself is a dynamic social act to be understood historically and then extrapolated upon in the present. And he says rather provocatively, when the academician said, why do you design this building with people defacing it with graffiti and it's a little bit worn already? And he said, we only think that buildings gain their relationship to society when they're at least 5 years old and have begun to live and breathe and reflect their society. So that, in short, was what something of the controversy of the reception of these drawings, still remembered a half a century later by Viollet-le-Duc as a great breaking point. Here's some more details of that. Now, interesting too to then put one more thing into my configuration here of 1828. 1828, Labrouste, Paestum. 1828, as we'll see in a moment, Heinrich Hoopes in a famous pamphlet, In What Style Should We Build? 1828, the first use of the word avant-garde as an artist's demeanor. And 1828 to 1830 are the years when the front page news was as much about the dispute at the Jardin des Plantes, the Natural History Museum in Paris, between the great natural scientists Geoffroy de Saint-Hilaire and Georges Cuvier, seen, do we have Cuvier? Yeah, Cuvier seen here in the left in this bust by David Donget. In the late winter of 1830, when their debates over the relationship between form and function in prehistoric animal skeletons and the organization of everything from primitive fish through dinosaurs that were being collected at the Natural History Museum in Paris made front page news. Not the least from Goethe. Goethe here recalled for his famous search for the laws of the underlying metamorphosis of plants, also a treatise on the relationship between form and function. Goethe, who said to his secretary that there was revolutionary news from Paris, and he was referring not to the political revolution that had overthrown the monarchy in that year, but rather the debate that he thought was animating everybody on the relationship of form to function between Cuvier and his idea of fixism and Geoffroy de Saint-Hilaire in his first suggestions of a kind of law of evolutionary change. So in this complex debate between the issue of the fixity versus mutability of species, many, many artists saw a kind of parallel to their own activity. So parallel too to the debate over local knowledge and local form for architecture as opposed to any notion of a universal ideal. Now, to stay with 1820, one can't resist to show these beautiful watercolors by Labrouste, even if PowerPoint is the least appropriate medium to show the beauties of graphic production. But this wonderful drawing that Labrouste did privately that I think really embodies this notion of the relationship of mutability of form and change are a series of studies that he does of Italian towns in which he imagines not only how social practices change the formal language of architecture, but how the entire town can be read as a palimpsest of change and different periods. So not an attempt to recreate the ideal moment here of the upper town of Agrigento, but rather to read the city itself as a palimpsest. So as we were walking around today looking at the university library and looking at other buildings by Pleshnik, I thought in some way I'm in a very late version of a Labrouste's world in which the architecture seems to be almost a palimpsest. Equally, here's another from that series, equally in 1828, and I'm sorry I could only find a slide of the English translation of this pamphlet, the dispersed German architectural community was likewise rocked by a controversy and the attention focused by this printed pamphlet. This in and of itself is interesting with the, of course, the technological changes in printing, the ability to do inexpensive printing in the 1820s and 1830s. The Saint-Simeonists who say that in the 19th century, this is maybe for you, Matouche, with Lefebvre, in the 19th century, the public square would be replaced by the printed newspaper and journal. And so therefore the idea that publicness was the ability to diffuse ideas. This was incredibly important in German architectural thinking because Germany being a very decentralized country, Heinrich Hoopes' little pamphlet immediately became actually an international debate, followed equally in Austria and throughout the German states in his pamphlet called In welchem Stil sollen wir bauen? In what style should we build? This was a pamphlet that I looked for many years. There was no copy in the United States, even though there were Hübsch pupils who came to the United States, until I finally ordered a copy and realized that the famous question was actually followed by the word beantwortet von Heinrich Hoopes, answered by Heinrich Hoopes, and so that the polemic, often interpreted as a sign of confusion, was in fact a very typical programmatic statement of a new historicist approach to architecture. Just like Henri Labrouste, Heinrich Hoopes offered a critique of reigning idealist approaches to classical models, in this case a systematic dismantling of one of the standard textbooks used in the earliest schools of architecture in Germany, used in Munich, Karlsruhe, and in Berlin, Alois Hirth's 1809, architecture according to the principles of the ancients, in favor of a plea for what he called the Rundbogenstil, the family of round-arched architectures of the early Middle Ages. Quite a number of examples upstairs that actually correspond to this notion of the Rundbogenstil. In terms of the materialist bias of Hertz's description of the Greek temple, something which bound the dynamic of historical change into the very nature of architecture as construction, Hübsch, in fact, took a great deal from Hertz, but he transformed it radically in a quest to find those moments in transition where one form or one style morphed to another, and to say that in those moments of transition, the architect, designer, historian, observer could observe the very process of change and calculate that change as the sort of springing point for the quest for the new. Interestingly, Schinkel had himself, in an unpublished document a number of years earlier, done a point-by-point dissection of Hertz's textbook, finishing his observations with the statement, "We must never be slaves of imitation, but rather look, quote, to the highest aim of our art, the eternal progress of the human species." So this fascination with change and with the ability to look at all of history as though it was a laboratory of change and dissect the dynamic of change in order to calculate it as the locus for invention. So what is, so here's Alois Hirt being deconstructed by various figures, and then these are the plates in which Hübsch begins to show how the, what is for him basically the transition from a columnar architecture to this, which he says the Romans must be dismissed because they applied the tectonics of Greek architecture to an arch system but didn't let arches express themselves, and it was only in the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, in which the arch was allowed to express itself, that a moment of change based on a new structural principle began to emerge. That, he says, is the dynamic for looking for an architecture for the great challenge of the 19th century that needs to adapt to a whole range of completely unprecedented building types, building demands, programmatic demands, with the inherited forms of architecture. The Romanesque in Europe seemed to him just such a phenomenon, patterned by the dissolution of the classical system, by racial interchange in the period of invasions and migrations, but yet responding over and over again to local conditions, so always producing a local architecture. And we can go back and forth, and I could do this through countless examples, but these are only some. And these are the sheets with which Labrouste taught his students. And they are meant throughout to show how very slight changes in building technology lead to slight modifications in stylistic expression, and that in fact what is not to be studied is a quest of static building forms, but rather things that lead to the understanding of history as patterns of change. So I think then what we could say in short is that what defined the central dynamic of historicist architecture, what I'm arguing comes about as a kind of radical, exciting proposal around 1830, is that architecture itself was a kind of research, a research which would draw variously on the privileged disciplines of the period, all disciplines which gave a vision into patterns of change and the relationship between types or norms and changes, development, or even, as it was beginning to be described, into evolution. Both architects, Hübsch and Labrouste, moreover, posited the tremendous importance of transitional periods in face of the theories of golden moments, which had been the 18th century ideal, which would remain one of the most disputed precepts of historicist thought and one of the greatest stumbling blocks for translating historical analysis into architectural composition. So, let's one of the most fascinating things that happens during this period, too, in this new phenomena of tourism of the modern, that we might say, is trans-Rhine sort of cultural tourism. And one of the most fascinating figures is a French figure by the name of Hippolyte Fortoul, who decides to take a tour of Germany in order to do two things. One, to figure out how the country that gave us Herder and Hegel could apply historical knowledge to the quest for contemporary expression in all of the arts. He was interested in music, literature, painting, and architecture. He wrote a very widely read but now completely forgotten book called On Art in Germany in 1840. And in the context of that book, this is just to give you some example of how Heinrich Hoopes adopted his style to a whole range of building types and ultimately to the quest for completely new forms, the segmental arch combined with iron in a series of programmatic buildings, particularly here the famous drinking hall or a spa at Baden-Baden of about 1840, and ultimately even deriving catenary arches a full century before Gaudi in a series of church designs there. Similar types of forms taking place in the expression of Henri Labrouste for a building that was based on the perception of how one might combine and synthesize all of the great moments of transition in architecture in the past into an architecture that could be a springboard for the future, something that ultimately would be translated by many figures. Here, Léon Vaudoyer designing a new cathedral for Marseille that was meant to be an expression of all of the historical forces that had historically come through the port of the Mediterranean into France and all of the transition periods that needed to be understood in order to create a building that was at once, in his mind, a synthesis of all past history and a pointing of how that history could take one into the future. So here's the plate of one of these French observers of Germany, Hippolyte Fortoul. And Hippolyte Fortoul would also become an activist critic, writing explanations of the architecture of the so-called Romantic group, Henri Labrouste, Félix Dubon, who we'll see in a moment, and others, including Vaudoyer, the author of this cathedral, who was the architectural advisor to this book. But its really most interesting moment, and it's quite a complex book in the architecture of the argument. One of his great disappointments is he rushes to Berlin. He hopes to hear the very last lectures of Hegel, but Hegel has just died too late. But he begins to try to read the way in which a philosophy of history shapes a cityscape. And he draws a comparison between two German capitals, Prussian capital of Berlin on the left here, symbolized by Schinkel's great museum on the island in the Spree, and then on the right, the Bavarian capital of Munich, as it had been recently transformed by Ludwig I, the great patron of notably of Leo von Klenze, and here with another early museum building, the Glyptothek in Munich. But rather than look at individual buildings or even look for a specific style of Munich versus a style of Berlin, he sees in these two cities two completely different attitudes about the relationship of understanding the historical past to projecting the historical future. And he sees Munich as absolutely the perfect textbook example of what not to do. Fascinatingly, this is in the wake of a book like Pugin's Contrasts, which begins this great 19th century fashion for on the left, what not to do, on the right, what you should do. And so Munich is what you should not do. You should not be like a museum curator of architecture in the streets like Ludwig I and collect one of each, a Renaissance Revival library, a Romanesque Revival church, a copy of a triumphal arch to open the street. Rather, he's impressed by, in Berlin, the way Schinkel conjugates a single principle of change in order to create a whole series of buildings. This is, of course, very blurry, sorry, it's a very bad view, but one of these views down the Spree of the customs buildings, the administration building, ultimately the museum, and the architecture school, all of which are different but are made out of a set of tectonic elements that can be interpreted differently, inflected by materials, by a kind of progressive notion of a style as a matrix for change and evolution. So Munich for him becomes a kind of almost a semantic problem. What style is it? Here's the real confusion, where every style seems to be represented of a city that he calls it a city of a collector. Whereas Berlin, he says, is the place to look because there Schinkel has the honor of what he calls the direction of what should be the new Germanic art. And he says this is exactly what was beginning to emerge in the philosophy of history being taught at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris by a figure who's just died, historian who was one of the first to teach history of architecture to the students, Nicolas Huyot. You see him here recorded in one of these medallion busts in the 19th century parts of the École des Beaux-Arts. It's fascinating how 19th century kind of portrait galleries always present the people who were household names in their period, completely forgotten today. He was already worried about the fact that Rio was disappearing into oblivion when he said that Rio had actually already begun to define the project that he witnessed on the ground in Germany. And so the attempt was the need to follow the Germans. This is David Donge recording the German artists. And this, he says, the great result, the ability of the French to take up what the Germans have suggested and to bring it finally to synthesis. And it's for Toul, writing from Germany, which he had visited with the advice of an earlier Germanophile, David Donge, to seek out artists, architects, historians, and philosophers, and to really read the contemporary landscape almost as though it was a history in change as written by the Saint-Simonians. It's not surprising that Gutenberg would play such an important role in this philosophy and the history of printing. Gutenberg's name is inscribed on Labrouste's facade, and in those very same years, David Donge, the Romantic sculptor who was a friend to all of these architects, worked to erect a monument to Gutenberg and to the printing press on one of the main squares in Strasbourg. Here you see it, in which the printing press is seen as the universal instrument of emancipation. Not only now the emancipation of ideas and of historic principles that I'm talking about, but also one that had led to all of the great social changes. This is Wilberforce freeing the black African slaves through the power of the printing press, and the whole history. This is America coming into existence through the ability to print the Declaration of Independence. And so this whole philosophy of the idea of emancipation, which strangely enough is now going to get written by this whole generation into histories of architecture. So if we start to look at Romantic histories of architecture around 1840, they begin to see moments of stylistic emancipation. Literally, the notion, paraphrased from Heinrich Hoopes, that what the Renaissance was the liberation or the enfranchisement of the arch to realize its structural expression. So all of this, I think, sounds rather uncanny and kind of obscure to us, but it is this search for these kind of motors of historical law that that governs all of this architecture. So what I want to do in the remaining time is really just to look at two pairs of monuments, and two pairs of monuments that might seem to have almost nothing to do with one another if we were stylistic historians of architecture. One, a pair of architecture schools, arguably the first purpose-built in the history of architecture. And of course, architecture schools are in themselves a manifesto of architecture, built manifesto. One in Paris, the École des Beaux-Arts on the left, and the other, Schinkel's School of Architecture and Building Administration in Berlin, now demolished since it was dynamited by the East Germans in 1961, but which stood for the better part of more than a century on the banks of the Spree. And then in closing, I'm going to turn to two theater buildings, one by Garnier and one by Gottfried Semper. Now, Félix Dubon's École des Beaux-Arts on the left and Schinkel's Bau Academy are two of the period's most cogent and self-conscious reflections on the historical nature of architectural invention, although the contrast between the two might at first seem so pronounced as to render my comparison completely useless. Dubon's building is a composition of elements, a kind of museum of architecture, a scenographic reuse of fragments from earlier buildings that were on the site or had been moved to the site, whereas Schinkel's is a freestanding, brand new building entirely of his own composition. But what they have in common, what I want to just show you briefly, is that both of them were meant to do at least two things simultaneously, particularly for the students of architecture who were to frequent them. One was to give them a crash course in the history of architecture, as though you could only make architecture if you understood the history of architecture. The problem, of course, with the history of architecture was that it was filled with enormous diversity, so one needed to teach students a main kind of line of narrative, a evolution that they could read and that would be extremely clear, and that this evolution could in turn inspire the creation of the new. So let's take that apart. Then we're going to turn to these two theaters, Schinkel and Semper. We might have also taken Heinrich Hoopes here. Heinrich Hoopes himself, an author of a very interesting school of architecture, still standing today, the Technical University in Karlsruhe, as well as an extremely interesting, now demolished, programmatic theater. But we'll leave him out and switch to first Duval and Schinkel, and then Garnier and Semper. This is one of a series of wonderful watercolors that recently came to light. It had been lost for many decades in a East German archive. It had been sent as a wedding gift to the Duke of Mecklenburg by the King of France in about 1840 to show a portrait of Paris as a modernizing city. It was an album of the monuments of Paris, and each architect who had an important commission was asked to do a series of watercolors to show his design for this royal marriage. So it's a kind of museum of modernity, if you will. Anyway, it came to light about 10 years ago. There's a very amusing story. I looked for it for years during my doctoral research, and I wrote to a series of archives in East Germany trying to find it. And all I received in return was a series of bills to be paid in dollars for the lack of any information on the album in the archive in question. I feared for years to go to the DDR if I ever do research because I figured I had a negative balance, although I had never gotten answer to my question. It actually turned out to be in one of the archives that had billed me for the knowledge that it wasn't there. But it's an extremely revealing document, in particular for us, because with the student riots in 1968 at the École des Beaux-Arts, much of this decor was demolished. And so the interesting thing I would even put forth is that it is today almost impossible to read the only completely new building here, which is Félix Dubon's Palace of the Fine Arts, the main student building of the École des Beaux-Arts ensemble, because he means it to be read in relationship to these series of historical buildings in the foreground. And it was actually this that led to one of the great controversies inside the approval body, the Council on Civic Buildings in Paris in 1836, when he submitted a set of drawings rather like this one, in which you could not see his facade for the things that were in the way. And the committee kind of came back and said, you know, can't you take the things that are away so we can get a clean view of your building as monument? And he said, no, I calculated my building to be understood in relationship to these earlier fragments. These fragments, it's interesting to talk about them in this building because these fragments are actually the remnants of one of the world's very first museums of architecture, the Museum of French Monuments that had been created by the extraordinary figure of Alexandre Lenoir, historian, sculptor, architectural historian, museographer, first person ever to call himself a curator, in the 1790s. And he had brought together there all sorts of fragments of buildings that had been expropriated by the French Revolution, including this, which was the centerpiece of a medieval chateau, the Chateau of Gaillon in Normandy, transitional from the medieval to the Renaissance as a kind of a frontispiece, a way of denoting entry in a building. The frontispiece around the entrance to Philibert Delorme's chateau at Annette, for Diane de Poitiers. And then he wanted to get, which he never got for this side, which is why you don't see it, an earlier example of the same, so that the students could see the transition of the exact same problem. How do you express the center of a building, a frontispiece around a door, in relationship to how it had changed through historical style, but was the same building morpheme, if you will, linguistically, and which in turn, after you went through this one, would explain the central massing of his composition behind. So here he is collecting from this Museum of French Monuments, the Chateau of Gaillon as it had appeared when it was a garden gate, And then now you can see this building denuded, but revealing the centerpiece in what he would call the modern style as it had developed from the French and Italian Renaissance towards modern expression. Interestingly, too, this was the building that was under construction when he took over. Previous architect, actually his father-in-law, De Bray building here, he wanted to put a literal triumphal arch. He rejects that in favor of this imbrication of a frontispiece in the long tradition of frontispieces. And the whole building is made as a kind of architectural promenade in which the student or the visitor will understand all of the diversity of history according to a line of development which leads to what he will call the seed of development for the new building. Now, this concept of a seed, too, is fascinating. These are other views of it before 19th century views. Duval, the architect then of the new, his own architectural renderings from his trip to Italy were always about screens and palimpsests and how things were seen through other things, so the kind of screens of history through which the present was both viewed and emerged, recorded very beautifully by one of the great architectural photographers of the 19th century, Charles Marville, here, probably better known for his photographs of Paris right before the demolitions of Haussmann, but here recording the relationship between historical fragments and new composition. So this idea of seed is actually interesting because it was a term that was used by those 19th century critics who understood Schinkel's Building Academy. Now, Schinkel's Building Academy was a fascinating building because it was kind of at this point that he a little bit lost his critics. Everyone understood the Greek colonnade of the Altus Museum. Everybody understood the Gothic forms of some of the early church designs. But when this building was unveiled, many people were unable to figure out what its exact historical reference was, and they didn't actually immediately know how to respond to it. But for Schinkel, it was a synthetic building that reflected on the whole history of architecture, drew from it, and tried to develop it. And if one were to put together a kind of reader of all of the critical reactions, there are those critics who are mystified because they do not know how to read a language of evolution. They still want it to be a recognizable reproduction of something. And there are those critics who are kind of in a line with Schinkel's thought. And one of them refers to it, he says, as a grain of seed. It belongs, he says, neither exclusively to the ancient world, nor to the Middle Ages, or even to the Renaissance. Our new architecture school is a grain of seed which promises future organic unfolding. And this is one of the great clues, I think, to reading the building. Not only is it a analysis of a Renaissance palazzo emerging into a segmental arch frame, of a type that expands on the building technologies he'd seen in English factories, but tries to, in a certain sense, ennoble them with a historical argument. But this theme of unfolding and of an underlying form that gives rise to great diversity is taken up in all of the ornamentation of the building, which is itself an incredibly complex iconographic program to be decoded by the students. So on the one hand, we have a whole series of the evolution of the elements of architecture, the columns and their relationship to myths of plant origins. And then beginning here, you can see these two plants here, and continuing on the inner face of this portal is a series of leaf forms that burst open, sprout and change. I don't think I have the details of it as they go up. And very interestingly, as was discovered a number of years ago, those leaf forms represent the theory, Goethe's theory of the metamorphosis of plants, and the fact that the entire plant world can be traced back to Goethe's search for the kind of ore or primordial plant from which all plant diversity had developed. And interestingly enough, that theory had just been given new popular appeal when it was pronounced in one of the famous lecture series of the 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt's Cosmos, which took place just a few streets away to sold-out audiences. So Paris and Berlin, places where natural history was actually crowd-getting activity, and that theory of diversity through underlying law is played out in the building through human history, through building history, and through natural history, and then grafted into the cityscape as one element of a whole series of variations, as we've already seen. So these buildings that appear to have almost nothing to do with one another are share between them the idea of articulating and making evident a set of historical laws and then seeking to act upon them. Interestingly, upstairs as well, you have one example of an architect who also worked in monument preservation. And so the interaction in the 19th century is also fascinating between these laws of history that are meant to generate modern buildings and the activity of restoring historical monuments. Here, France takes the lead. It's in 1840 that the Commission on Historic Monuments is created, and one of the very first projects is by Duval, the same architect who did the École des Beaux-Arts, here restoring the chateau at Blois. And the interesting thing about this restoration of the chateau at Blois is he made sure to restore each part so that its differences would be absolutely apparent, rather than trying to harmonize all of the building phases, to the extent, and this is one of the most unbelievable moments, this is Duval in an absolutely exquisite watercolor of what he found at Blois. And if you go there today, you will not see this piece, because it had been changed over time, and he knew that it was the earliest part of the chateau, and he wanted you to be able to read the building, because he was paraphrasing a phrase from Fortoul that becomes the theory of all of this architecture, which is architecture is the veritable writing of civilization. And so you needed to be able to read this almost the way you would read a historical novel by Michelet or a textbook by Guizot, as French history written in stone. And so he reinvented the earliest piece of the facade, what would have been this 12th century hall, divided down the middle by a central row of columns, to be red on the outside. There's a central row of columns. You can't see it here. And so this is a completely invented Gothic facade in order that the building be what he called a resume of our national architectural history, something that he then carries over for the students, and which is carried over in its most synthetic statement, and I'll finish this first case study and be very quick on the second one, in the most synthetic of all French monuments of the period, Henri Labrouste's Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, which fascinatingly enough takes us right back to his restoration study of the temples of Paestum. If you will recall, if I were to go, I'm not going to go all the way back, maybe I actually have it in here now. The one I showed you, if you can recall that image, was looked like a temple, and it had a central row of Doric columns right down the center, bisecting the room in half. And Labrouste got everybody very upset because he said it's not a temple. There could never be a temple in which you would have a row of columns down the sacred space. It's a civic basilica, and the subdivision of the space down the center is a plan type that always represents public use. Because in any sacred building, you would be able to move down the central axis. And he said, we also know this is true even in the medieval monastery, because in the medieval monastery, the church nave is open, but the refectory, where the monks read books to one another and ate, had a central row of columns bisected into a double-barreled space. And so in the end, what this building is the next stage in a type that goes back to the ancient basilica with its central row of Doric columns, the place of assembly, of intellectual exchange and of reading, the refectory, which was also a reading room in the medieval monastery, and then here, the double-barreled space of the world's first publicly opened library, conceived as a synthesis of all of those types, but also putting on display the newest building material of French construction, cast iron, in these very, very attenuated columns. This is one of the great rooms of the 19th century. You should go visit it in Paris. But it had, and if you go, what you do is you show up at 9. The students are allowed in at 10, and if you show up at 9, you can visit this absolutely incredible interior. I should show it to you in full Technicolor, but in my view, the library was fundamentally, in a certain sense, our ability to read it was fundamentally transformed in the 1960s when the head librarian decided that more students needed to get into this room, and he took out this central row of shelves under the columns, which now stand completely free, and turned all the tables 90 degrees so they bisect the space this way, when in fact what Labrouste wanted was the idea of a very kind of local place for reading, with reflected in the ceiling the notion that you were part of a greater whole, but that you weren't distracted by the view of all the readers. Complete footnote, but I was struck this morning in the university library by Pleshnik having all the readers sit on only one side of the table so that you're not actually looking at the faces of most of the other people who are reading, which is exactly what is going on here as Labrouste thinks of not only historically, how do I build the next chain in the history of a type, a bisected space, for the secular assembly of people doing individual things in public, but how psychologically do I create a space in which I can contemplate on my reading and at the same time feel that I'm in an august place of public assembly. So all of this, we could go back to the École des Beaux-Arts where contemporary figures are incorporated into that history, but I think also interesting to look at how Dubon's architecture itself evolves between here, 1840, and his last addition to the École des Beaux-Arts, which is this on the Seine facade, facing the Louvre, and certain references to aspects of the Louvre's architecture across the way, but also a building that is post-Labrouste, in which he responds to the huge fenestration, the skeletal likeness, and in which he brings a kind of final synthesis of classic French medieval and French Renaissance into a skeletal expression of a building that has an enormous amount of structural iron. Likewise, Schinkel simultaneously designing this building and creating these great pedagogical panoramas. This is only a section of this kind of great scroll called the Langes Blatt, or the Long Sheet, which is a history of the evolution of the morphemes of construction as something that will generate the seed for all creation. So I think I'll skip. Yeah, these are some more of those plates. This is, of course, part of my polemic. This is the Germans, which are capable simultaneously of proposing to recreate this building at the same time as they tear this one down. This is a complete footnote. I wrote an article against this, both this demolition of the Palais des Républiques, but also the attempt to recreate the demolished building academy by citing a great line of Schinkel, which was, history has never repeated past history, and if it did, history would stop in that moment. So this very fascinating notion that there can never be repetition, there can only be theme variation, evolution, and change. He takes it into his prototypes for new architectures up to what would have been Schinkel's University Library, one of his very last projects there. Now let's then just finish with another moment that I think is fascinating to look at, and I think that would take this kind of into the next generation of experimental experimental buildings. And I'll do it very, very quickly because I think I've made the point. I would like to say that there are not all 19th century production would lend itself to this exercise that I'm undertaking, but there are many actually programmatic buildings of the 19th century that deserve to be understood for their complex formal response to the idea of the evolution of laws of history. The next would take us to two figures who come simultaneously out of the Franco-German circles in Paris in the 1840s and 1850s, particularly around the figure of Hittorf. There is Schinkel again. To remember that Gottfried Semper, we had a very interesting discussion yesterday about the potential response ultimately of Plečnik and his teaching to the theory of Bekleidung or dressing of Gottfried Semper. This is often seen as a kind of German line, somehow separate from the French, but interesting to remember that Gottfried Semper's first interaction with this study of archaeology to come up with a theory of clad expression comes out of the same circle as Labrouste. This is Labrouste's brother, imagining the temple at Cora, an Etruscan temple, as a kind of painted altar for civic celebration. And this is Gottfried Semper's very first attempt to apply those ideas to archaeological study. And likewise, therefore, Labrouste, who treats the library as a kind of civic monument that is decorated with his notion that all of architectural form comes out of the quotidian language of celebration. So here a building that is clad with garlands that then become petrified, that become stone, or for instance, Labrouste in his second library, imagining the forehall as a hung room, interested by the fact that in early palace architecture, carpets were moved around to create a temporary inhabitation and ennobling of a space. And so here the wall treated as a kind of permanent carpet, very parallel to Gottfried Semper's complex developments of those theories. And so we could follow this through Semper's work from his search for expression for Jewish architecture in the Great Lost Synagogue at Dresden, to the extraordinary work in the rebuilding of Dresden through two phases. And I guess I would just conclude in saying that we have so much a tendency to look at 19th century architecture as surface. What becomes fascinating in a figure like Semper, particularly when you see the tendency of him to draw his buildings as part of an urban plan, is his fascination in the wall of the building as a kind of membrane between the interior space and the exterior space, between the interior ceremony and the capacity of the building, here the Court Theater in Dresden, connected ultimately with a project for a whole culture forum in Dresden, connecting the Zwinger to the Elbe, but thinking of the walls of those buildings as almost the outdoor hanging of a civic forum. There are the examples of it. No less Garnier's theater. Now these are buildings that have tended to be interpreted as radically opposed to one another, and I think there are actually very interesting similarities. All of the exterior wrapping of spaces in Garnier's great theater, both of them sometimes reduced by being talked about as neo-Baroque architecture, but very interested in this kind of spatial wrapping of a membrane between a highly decorated space that is meant to transform the space of the street immediately outside into a kind of public theatrical ceremonial forum. So I could go into great length to quote Garnier's writings in Le Théâtre and Semper's late writings and find echoes, and I think they were aware of one another if I was trying to demonstrate the Franco-German connection. But I think that the key thing is that over and over again, the reduction of buildings to their type neo-Baroque, neo-this, has obscured from view a great deal of programmatic and advanced thinking that made this architecture at its time not an architecture of nostalgia, but an architecture of progressive exploration. So I think I'll stop there with all of these people filling the theater. A wonderful statement in which Charles Garnier said that he only designed the building as a backdrop to the clothes of those who would come in, or for that matter, Semper, who talked about his buildings as a kind of almost clothing of the public space, a kind of Bekleidung not only of the materials of construction, but of the materials of the public agora or forum, which fascinated me. And I'll just say in conclusion, I'm really thrilled to be here. I thought that when I brought this PowerPoint that had nothing to do with Ljubljana, but as you can see, I've been thinking about what I was going to say tonight, and perhaps a little bit too much. I've been seeing it over and over again in the incredible connection between built form and urban form all through the center of Ljubljana. So it's a huge pleasure to be here, and thank you for listening to me so patiently.